Hey everyone, this is Service Pack Sean here. So if you're here, I thank you for your interest in trying to learn a bit more about the SolidWorks API, and I thank you for hopefully watching the Macro Mischief video. I hope you had as much fun watching it and hopefully pranking your coworkers as I did making these macros and making the ensuing video. So here what we have as part of the explainer video, which we're kicking off right now, we have the boss excuse me macro. You can see up top here in the VBA window, which is pretty much where we do a lot of our macro writing, a lot of our macro editing, and debugging. We see that name, the title of the macro right there. And as I mentioned in the Macro Mischief video, the macros that I created for that specific video, making the different pranks, very simple macros, right? So if we look at this specific macro for boss excuse me, again, all that did was it closed down the active SolidWorks session. But it's pretty cool because if you look at this macro, you get a sense for how to control the SolidWorks session in a way that allows you to run a macro that dictates what it does. So if we look here up at the top, we have this command here, and this is really just a variable declaration. You'll notice if I click on this line, it understands that we're in the declarations portion. Now in VBA, which is the language you will use most likely if you were developing macros, I always say to people if they ever ask me, what's a good place to, or where's a good place to start in looking to get into the SolidWorks API, I always mention just try writing some basic Microsoft Excel macros. They use the same language. They use Visual Basic for applications. It's a really easy way to get into the flow of a bit of software programming, software automation. So I definitely recommend just looking a bit into that if you're brand new. If you've done Microsoft Excel programming or really any basic programming with VBA or similar language, you understand what a variable is. But for those of you who don't, this declaration statement dim SWApp as SLDworks.SLDworks. This conforms to the SolidWorks object model, and we're basically establishing in our computer's memory to hold and reserve space for a variable that I've personally chosen to name SWApp. Now, this code would function the same if I had named that variable flamingos or cars or trucks. Doesn't really matter. Always try to make your variable names so pretty intelligible. For you later, if you ever look to edit this code, or for someone else, say if you're lending this macro out to someone else for editing or for learning or for usability. Now this part though, after we do the as, where we typecast that variable, this part is not up to interpretation. So this conforms to the SolidWorks API object model, and this is the top level object, the SLDworks object. If you ever take the API course, or if you look more into the API, you'll see this is, if you think of the API object as a flowchart, the SLDworks object interface is pretty much a SolidWorks application. You can think of it that way. And from that and underneath that, everything else, let's say 3D sketches, reference planes, whatever else you're trying to automate, can kind of be derived from there under its ensuing and linked objects. But whenever you're looking to automate SolidWorks, you're probably going to see this line. If you look up in the API help or in the API forums at solidworks.com, macro examples, you're very likely to find that in almost every case you have a variable that's declared as type and uses type SLDworks.SLDworks. So long story short, again, this is basically a variable that represents our future controlling of the SolidWorks application. Now, likewise, we mentioned, or I mentioned just a moment ago, that this line is going to be found in most, if not every macro you're going to come across within the SolidWorks API sphere. This area is the same. For those of you who are familiar with programming to some extent, and maybe even furthermore familiar with VBA, this won't come as a surprise to you, but every VBA every VBA script, you could say, or every SolidWorks macro has to have an entry point. And this is designated here as submain, so subroutine main. So basically this is what tells your macro where to start. So it starts executing from here, and then it goes, line by line, seeing if there's a command or a computation to run through to kind of get things going. So submain's there, and then you'll see a lot of green text. A couple, 3 lines here of green text. Green text you can kind of write whatever you want, and it's designated by this single quote mark here that I see on these 3 lines. Now I've put those there for comments. You can tell some of them are pretty goofy, again, keeping the spirit of mischief night. And I try to keep things fun, obviously. The coding can get a bit mundane. But you'll see here this variable says, or this comment rather says, connect variable to running instance of SolidWorks for manipulation, and trust me, there will be manipulation. And truly there is if you're pranking someone. So, and you'll notice that both of these lines are preceded initially here by single quotes. So you have to do a single quote on every line using VBA to designate that when it comes time to run this macro, that those lines are effectively ignored when it's compiled, and they're really just there for us humans to understand why the code's there. So you'll see this is really our first true command in the subroutine, and we're setting that variable that we had set aside memory for to the running instance of the SolidWorks application. So we do set SWApp, and we do set we precede the variable assignment with set anytime we're setting a value equal to a variable when we're working with object types. You can get more into that later. You don't have to worry about that now. But this is another thing. Basically, this dual pairing of this line and this line, you're going to see, if you look at other macros, you're going to see that almost every time you're working with a macro that's controlling the running instance of the SolidWorks interface. So that kind of, you can think of it as that hooks into this running instance, the instance I have in the background in this case. And then once we have control of that, that pretty much gives power to this SWApp variable to where you can then close the app using its commands. So I'm going to basically take that app that I've hooked into and use a special command within the SolidWorks API. You can Google exit app SolidWorks API, and you'll find a nice help article on it that will close the application. So in my video, naturally I hooked it to a boss issued icon as a bit of a prank, and that can be quite manipulative, obviously. In this case, for learning purposes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how you can use the VBA interface to step through line by line to see perhaps if it's observable what each line of code does for you. So you'll notice if I click within the submain area, I'll click here, 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 or here, anywhere, and I press the F8 key on my keyboard. You'll notice that highlights the first line here in the subroutine, kind of establishing the subroutine submain. If I continue to press F8, you can almost think of that in SolidWorks as me taking the rollback bar and rolling down one feature at a time, just seeing what that feature has on the model. But in this case, we're seeing what effect each line of code may have on our SolidWorks interface. So if we press F8 again, you'll notice it completely skips over these commented areas because, again, at compilation, it doesn't really care because those are just comments. It's not really going to execute a command. Press F8 there. Usually in instances like those, you're not really going to see much in terms of user feedback, but it didn't error out, right? So that's kind of a good sign. It seems that whatever command I tried to pass there took. Now this one, once I press F8, we're going to see an action. Press F8 and the SolidWorks interface goes away, and I'm left with my desktop backdrop just like I had in my video. So that was a quick explanation of boss ExcuseMe. You saw with a few simple commands we were able to control and manipulate the SolidWorks interface.